Our next panel member is a veteran lawmaker and member of the 18th Congress of the Republic of the Philippines, representing the 4th District of the province of Leyte. He is the chairperson of the Committee on Disaster Resilience. Under her leadership, the committee approved and passed the bill establishing the Department of Disaster Resilience, and a bill which provides free freight services for relief good distribution in disaster affected areas. She also continues to fast track other critical legislation, such as establishing standardized evacuation centers in every municipality and city, and the Marawi Compensation Bill. She likewise played key roles in Congress's response to the Taal volcanic eruption and the Defeat COVID-19 Committee. Friends, we have Congresswoman Lucy Torres-Gomez.
Good morning.
Ma'am, we have heard the President articulate the urgency to pass a law establishing a Department of Disaster Resilience for the past 3 State of the Nation addresses already. And after every major disaster like the Taal volcano eruption, this pandemic, and the recent typhoons and flooding, the discussion on the need to harmonize fragmentation in DRM policies and programs, it always comes up. So, Kong Lucy, do you think that we really need a Department of Disaster Resilience? Why is this important? We have seen you leading the Committee on Disaster Resilience, swiftly approving and passing the bill in Congress. What do you think? Is it really important?
Thank you, Attorney Leslie, for that question. And my answer will actually echo Benedict's presentation. It makes perfect sense to house all the critical units under one department, because as it is now, what we have is, how do I say this? A disaggregated system where help comes quickly, but it comes in trickles. There is duplication of efforts. Accountability is not clear, and reporting lines also are not clear. And government is always well-intentioned. No government will want to fail its people, but we are only as strong as our weakest link. And I think it's a glaring weakness really when, okay, let's take, for example, Ulysses. After the disaster, when everyone should have been concentrating on post-disaster rehab efforts and recovery, a lot of finger pointing was still happening. Questions like, who should have called the shots? Who is responsible for calling the shots of releasing water? And we should be past that already, because every year we get about 40 disasters. We're the 4th most disaster-prone country in the world. So we actually should have a battle plan in place already. So under a DDR, there will be clear reporting lines. There will be no duplication of efforts. Tasks will be defined, and reporting lines also will be clearer. More than that, there will be a cabinet secretary who will work on the department full time, and he will be like a whip. Somebody will really be in charge. We will not have to ask anymore, who is in charge? Who do we ask? So a cabinet secretary with a bird's eye view or a big perspective of the problem, somebody who will be mindful always that disaster is not a local problem. It's a series of integrated problems that we have to learn to connect.
May I ask Kong Lucy that, ma'am, you were involved, you were on the ground helping in the response and recovery efforts of several major disasters. With your experience in Typhoon Yolanda, the flooding and earthquakes in Ormoc City, Taal volcano eruption, and this pandemic, what are some of your top 3 lessons learned? And how did you incorporate that as you finalize the Department of Disaster Resilience bill?
Well, top of mind, Attorney Leslie, just basing on what I experienced during Typhoon Haiyan, that was a first also for us, and it was the biggest typhoon to make landfall, in recorded history. Top of mind would be for the warnings. It has to be area specific or area focused, hazard specific, and time bound. And communication is very important also, because in the Tacloban area, a lot of people did not know what a storm surge was.
Storm surge, yes.
Yeah. In fact, if they had called it a tidal wave, then there would have been more of an urgency, because you'll have to understand, Attorney Leslie, that in that part of the Philippines, we always get typhoons. So when you say it's a very strong typhoon, for the longest time, we were used to strong typhoons that we could weather. But then the Typhoon Haiyan came and it was a storm surge and it was actually a tidal wave. So communication is very important. Number two, I'd like to put focus on the dignity of victims, because many times during the rehabilitation process, I've seen agencies, without wanting this to be political, no, but I'll just say it factually because it is really what I experience on the ground. They approach the victims with a level of mistrust already, and these are already a people in pain, and they should not have to justify why they need a sack of rice. They should not need the concurrence of the barangay captain. Why is his signature needed for his relief pack to be released to him? So that is why it's very important for us to have protocols in place so that when a disaster happens, help is available to all, regardless of political color. And then number three, we have to set a timeline in terms of rehabilitation efforts, because another disaster will always come along and the focus moves to that new disaster. I'll give you an example. In just early this year, we awarded another set of units, housing units for Yolanda victims. Yolanda happened in November of 2013. There have been other disasters, and yet here we are still awarding units for Yolanda victims. So it cannot go on forever and indefinitely. We have to put a time limit on when rehab efforts should be finished, because funds are available. And number three, I'd like to say siguro that dealing with a disaster is like going to war. So to win any war, you really need a battle plan. Your generals have to be in place before the war happens. You don't put together a team after or while the war is ongoing. So that's why we really need going back to why we really need a Department of Disaster Resilience. There are issues of it being another layer in the bureaucracy, but really we are just organizing the orchestra and putting a conductor so that everybody plays to the same music, and more efficient. There will be a more efficient system, and more efficient system will mean better use of limited resources. And in the DDR hearings, the DBM, maybe Secretary Avisado can confirm this, but if I remember correctly, because the RRMC will just be absorbed in the new DDR, it will, and all the budget is already in the 2020-2021 GAA, we will need about 1.5 billion to the disaster. But the main story really is to be prepared and to be resilient, because disaster is really the cause of the economic drag. It's like building sandcastles only for the next disaster to wash it away if we do not take this problem seriously.
How can we ensure that we remove politics out of choosing our secretary for the Department of Disaster Resilience? How do we not let this department be politicized? That's the first question, ma'am. The other one is there an opportunity to also integrate not just disaster response, but overall full spectrum rehabilitation, recovery, preparedness, prevention, and mitigation, as well as all these risk financing instruments. And then the other one is still on the same area. How do we make sure that we considered also some of the environmental and engineering interventions? Is there any bill in Congress that talks about making sure that you build back better, smarter, and then transform some of these affected areas into smart cities? So those are the three questions, ma'am. And then I'll slowly group these questions and then direct it to our panel members.
Okay. Do I respond now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Attorney Leslie, can I have the chance to respond to Mr. Luz about his concern, which I also agree with fully about how it should not linger in Congress, because we do know how some bills or some laws have a tendency to just linger until the next administration. Well, number one, the creation of a DDR is a priority measure of the president. So I think there is urgency there, and all the government agencies are in sync about wanting this department. Also, I'd like to make mention that we are not really starting from scratch, because we are beginning with people and units who are already acquainted with each other. What we're really doing is just institutionalizing the system and putting protocols in place and making sure that all these national agencies respond to a single voice who is directing them, because all these agencies have different bosses, and we've seen how it was after Ulysses when there was a lot of finger pointing. Who should have made the call to release the water from the dam? Why were they not informed this way or that? And sometimes also in terms of duplication of resources, it has happened because our resources are not really limitless, but then some departments tend to help an area that where the local leader has more access to the secretary maybe of that particular department, instead of the help being equally distributed in all areas of a disaster stricken locality. So that was to respond to Mr. Luz, and his points were very timely, and those are critical points really to consider. What was that question again, Attorney Leslie, about how it should not be politicized? That is precisely why we need a full-time cabinet secretary, because when the people are in pain, the tendency really is to just blame government, thinking that government is immortal or government has superpowers, supernatural powers. But we are all human, and like I said earlier, we are just as strong as our weakest link, and that is why we need somebody in charge so that we know who to go to when things go wrong. Yes, and you don't spend so much time making so many calls. I remember in one webinar you had Attorney Leslie, where you mentioned that just to get one thing done, you had to make maybe 5 phone calls, and that shouldn't be the case, because we have to respond always with urgency. Also, I feel that there is too much pressure given on the too much pressure put on LGUs. Maybe Governor Dax will agree. When you are an elected official, they really do not know the nitty gritty, the people. They just know that you are an elected official and you're supposed to help us. But if you think about the local disaster fund, the LGUs are mandated to set aside 5% of their ERA. But the accessibility to this fund, there is a disconnect, because the accessibility is dependent on the LGU's ERA, which is not necessarily reflective of their vulnerability to disasters. So there are LGUs with smaller ERA, but who are very vulnerable to disasters. And there are LGUs with very big ERA, but they probably don't get to use up their LDRRMF for the entire year, and it gets diverted to other uses, no? And we also have to stop looking at disaster as a local problem, because like what happened in Marikina, this goes beyond LGU boundaries, really. We need to, instead of just fixing flood drains, for example, instead of just fixing flood drains, we need to address the hydrologic challenges of the water source. We need to think of the management of dams. So all these things are really interconnected, and there has to be a holistic approach. As with anything, there has to be a holistic approach. And like I said, everything has to be in place before it actually happens. So we simulate how a disaster happens, and we keep on adjusting and updating as we go along.